uh, of halacha. And for Rosenzweig, as I spoke about last time, the idea of Jewish law is very, very central to him, which, as I mentioned, is interesting because we don't typically associate philosophers with a great appreciation for Jewish law, right? If you look at the course of Jewish history, oftentimes philosophy is considered to be in direct opposition to the law. And the fact that Rosenzweig is this great philosopher and grasps that Judaism is not just a collection of ideas, right? Many philosophers often want to reduce Judaism to ideas. Rosenzweig says, no, no, no. At its heart, Judaism is a religion of law. Now, again, we have to understand what that means. It's not law in the dry sense or in the black and white letter of the law, and that's all that matters. I would say, just to maybe summarize it briefly, for Rosenzweig, Judaism is a religion of law, or it is fundamentally about law. Rosenzweig doesn't actually like the word religion, but Judaism as a way of life is fundamentally about law because law is what captures our relationship to God, right? If at the heart of Judaism is this idea of brit, of covenant, of this relationship that binds God to the Jewish people and the Jewish people to God, then what reflects that sense of being bound, of covenant, is the sense of commandments. And law is the way in which we experience God's commanding voice in our lives. Again, we have to understand what that means. There's many layers to it, but that really, I think, is at the heart of it for Rosenzweig, that there's no Judaism without law. Judaism can't be reduced to law. Judaism isn't only law, but you can't have Judaism without law because law is the way, in a very simple sense, the way in which we connect to God. Now, to better develop these ideas about how Rosenzweig understands halacha and how halacha is this extension of brit, of covenant, of Torah, we're going to look at a debate between Franz Rosenzweig and Martin Buber on the idea of revelation. And as I've titled this, no revelation without commandment. That's Rosenzweig's perspective. If there is such a thing as an encounter with God, God revealing God's self to human beings, then however we conceive revelation to be, for Rosenzweig, commandment has to be at the center of that, right? You cannot have revelation without commandments, right? And that's why, if being Jewish is a response to God's revelation to the Jewish people at Sinai, then part of that ongoing response is going to be law, right? As I said, because there can't be revelation without commandments. So what we're going to do is we're going to begin by looking at Buber and his perspective on revelation and law, and we're going to contrast that with Rosenzweig. And again, when you look at the difference, I think a lot of important ideas, important nuances come to the fore. So Martin Buber, you've probably heard the name before. He too was a great German Jewish philosopher, born 1878. He dies 1965. He lives a pretty full, long life, whereas Franz Rosenzweig dies in his early 40s. So Rosenzweig dies in 29, 30, I can't remember exactly. Buber is a little bit older than Rosenzweig, and already when Buber is fairly young, he becomes an incredibly accomplished thinker, leader, persona amongst German Jewry. He is like the voice of his generation. Maybe that's the best way to sort of think about it for younger German Jews. If for most of the 19th century, German Jews trended towards Reform Judaism, Reform Judaism that was very similar, you might say, to like high church Protestantism, right? Synagogue looked a lot like German churches and what German Protestantism looked like. You went for the service, you went for the experience, you went for the sermon, but outside of that, the rest of the week, if you went at all on Shabbat, but which most German Reform Jews didn't. But even if you did go once a week on Shabbat, there wasn't much Jewishness to your life beyond that particular experience. Buber, however, is part of a generation of German Jews who want to engage in a renewal of Judaism. They recognize that the Judaism they've inherited from their parents, the Reform assimilated Judaism, is just not enough. It's just not really that Jewish at the end of the day. And Buber recognizes there's a possibility for renewal, for a return to the tradition and a renewal of the tradition. Now, Buber will never be confused as an Orthodox thinker, but it's important to understand that he grew up traditional Orthodox. His grandfather, Solomon Buber, is a very well-known Jewish academic in Germany, a Midrash scholar. You'll still find today versions of the Midrash, I think it's Midrash Rabbah, that were edited by his father. Buber lived with his grandfather. Buber lived with his grandfather up until the age of 14. And his grandfather was somewhat of an academic, but davened with Hasidim. And that was Buber's, childhood experience. So a sense of piety, tradition was a part of Buber's early life. He then lives with his father, however, at the age of 15. His father is pretty secular, pretty reform, and Buber ultimately sort of leaves traditional observance, but he becomes this great, passionate Jewish thinker, Jewish philosopher, and a Zionist. Right? Buber is the voice of young German Jews who see Zionism as an answer to the Jewish problem. Buber moves to Israel in the 30s. He becomes a professor at Hebrew University, an important Israeli public intellectual and figure. Rosenzweig reached out to Martin Buber in his early 20s to build a connection with him. And after Rosenzweig completes the Star of Redemption, the two develop a relationship and start engaging in a series of dialogues. They write letters to each other because that's what people used to do. We forget that, but they wrote long, deep, compelling letters to each other as they debated the issues that both of them felt were so important. The two would later go on in the mid-20s to work on the translation of the Tanakh, the Bible, into German. And it was a pretty revolutionary translation with a goal of, again, trying to get Torah out to a broader audience of Jews, to whom they believed there was a deep yearning for it. And what's something I also really appreciate is that Buber and Rosenzweig have similar pieces to their thought, but there are some fundamental differences, like very, very striking differences between them. They disagree on some very, very important things. And nevertheless, they maintain this very close relationship. I'm not so sure I could do it if I was them, meaning, especially today where we don't really have tolerance for people who think differently, and especially the people that are close to us. We want the people who are close to us to think exactly like us. And the fact that Buber and Rosenzweig could be such intimate friends and yet disagree on some pretty serious theological, philosophical ideas, but still hold on to that relationship is something very, very, I think, significant in a model that they could do it. And these were both not easy people, meaning these were people who could be fiery. These were people who could be difficult. They're both very, very strong, opinionated Jews, yet somehow they recognized that their relationship and their connection that they had for each other, the love they had for each other, transcended maybe some of their, philosophical positions that they held. As I said, what we're going to look today is the debate between Buber and Rosenzweig on a very big question, and that is the question of revelation. Right? And this is maybe the biggest question that any religion seeks to address, because if you are religious, you believe that God reveals God's self to human beings, right? Without revelation, you really can't have religion. You really can't have faith, because what is there, right? Even if you know God exists, that's one thing. But if God doesn't have a relationship, a direct and real relationship with human beings, then what is it, right? Rosenzweig actually points out that pagan religions before Judaism, they believed in gods. They might have even believed in a God, but they did not necessarily believe that God had a real ongoing relationship with human beings, right? So it's not just enough to know that there's a God out there. Without the revelation piece, again, what is religious life even all about? Now, for both of them, they both believe in revelation, right? But the question comes down to is, what do they think is actually going on when God reveals God's self to human beings? And obviously, this is a big question. If God's supposed to be infinite, God's supposed to be eternal, and we human beings are finite, we're limited, we're bound to our bodies, right? What kind of encounter can there be between God and human beings? And if there is such an encounter, we all know it's not going to just be another average Thursday in Cleveland, right? There's something very profound and special that's going to have to take place when revelation occurs. So we're going to look through a couple of Buber's writings here in order to tease out his understanding of revelation. The first is from an essay called Chirut. Chirut is the Hebrew word for freedom. And it was written, I think, in 1919 as part of a collection of essays that Buber wrote as a way of thinking about what it means to renew Judaism. I'll just mention this because I think it's worth noting. Many of the internal conversations you hear in the Jewish community in America, right? We're losing Jews. How do we make Jewish tradition meaningful to Jews? How can we renew the tradition, bring people back to God, to Torah? How do we get people to be involved in mitzvot again, right? Like those types of conversations were also playing out in German Jewry at the beginning of the 20th century. And there were real debates. How do we get Jews to stay Jewish? How do we make Judaism compelling for Jews? So Buber, in this particular essay, is actually dealing with the question of education. The question he's really dealing with is how do we educate the next generation of Jews to be Jewish? And not just to be Jewish, but to be Jewish in a truly meaningful and deep fashion. And I'll just point out, remember I said Chirut means freedom. The quote that Buber uses to open this essay is a piece from Pirkei Avot, where it says, God's writing engraved on the tablets. It's a reference to the Luchot, right? The Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments on the Luchot. Read not Charut. We should not read as if they were engraved on the Luchot, but Chirut, freedom, right? That somehow God's commandments are a reflection of freedom. Now, we don't have time to unpack what this might have meant for Chazal, but for Buber, it's pretty clear. Buber thinks that whatever our relationship to God is going to be, that freedom is going to be at the heart of it, right? That the tablets, which represent the covenants, which represent the mitzvot, that freedom is going to have to be an essential component to that. And it's a little contradictory because normally when we think about mitzvah, we don't think about freedom. But this rabbinic text does seem to emphasize the centrality of freedom to our relationship with God. And for Buber, that is going to be very, very important. Now, the piece from this essay I really want to focus on, we're going to come back to the freedom idea, is this statement that he puts out, where he basically acknowledges that, some people can be Orthodox. Some people can be frum. Some people can keep all 613 mitzvot, or at least try to keep all of the 613 mitzvot. But there's a reason that they're able to do that, he says. And the reason that they can do it is not necessarily a reason he would say that applies to himself or applies to most German Jews who, as I said, are Reform, right? They're growing up in a pretty assimilated background. So here's what he says. He says, genuine affirmation of the law must be anchored in this certitude of the fact of revelation and that its content has been faithfully preserved in the 613 mitzvot and their framework. Meaning, if you really want to be if you really want to feel yourself committed to the 613 mitzvot, then the only way that's possible is if you have certitude, if you have 100% confidence that not only did revelation take place at Har Sinai, but that the 613 mitzvot and the Torah are the exact utterances of God, God's specific commandments to us as human beings. And those 613 mitzvot, as they are recorded in the Torah, is exactly what we have before us today, right? If you believe that, if you believe all of those things to be true, and you're certain about it, then, you can do mitzvot, right? Because you believe they are divine truth. They are divine commandments, and you are absolutely certain about it. Now, again, does everybody who's Orthodox 100% know that all of the mitzvot, were given at Sinai and are divine? Not necessarily. It's not something we can necessarily prove, but we do typically assume it to be a ikar emunah, right? A principle of faith. But that's that principle of faith that seems to be central to be able to do the mitzvot. Because if we're not sure, if some of those mitzvot happen to have been, corrupted over time or maybe created by human beings, then how could we commit ourselves to them fully, right? Buber goes on to say, for those who have not been granted the certitude I spoke of, this insight charts a course that is incompatible with the acceptance of traditional law. Meaning, if you're not certain that these 613 mitzvot came from God or Har Sinai, like, how could you suddenly just submit yourself, give yourself over to doing the mitzvot. And I think, Buber is just raising a very basic problem for somebody who didn't grow up for somebody who didn't grow up religious, right? For somebody that maybe has a vague sense of God and a little bit of spirituality and, went to shul 3 times a year. Could we really ever expect them just to take on the mitzvot, all the mitzvot, right? It just wouldn't make sense, right? Like if they're going to take on the mitzvot, it has to come with this sense of faith and certitude that they're all from God. And how can somebody who wasn't raised like that ever develop that kind of faith and certitude about the mitzvot? So I think there's something very true to what Buber is saying here. If you grow up you are taught that, again, these are holy, these are divine, these came from God at Har Sinai. You sort of accept it and you have that certainty. But if you didn't grow up right, you can't manufacture it out of thin air. As I said, there aren't proofs that somebody can present you just to show that these things are completely true. Now, for Buber, I guess one other point I'll just add here. Buber is open to the possibility that even if the Torah, as we have it, wasn't completely given by God, that doesn't mean that there aren't plenty parts of the Torah that should still be relevant to us, right? And I think this is interesting because where Reform Judaism in Germany basically said as follows, what Reform Judaism said was, we know what the real message of the Torah is, and we can reduce it down to basic principles, right? Basically ethical principles, right? This idea of ethical monotheism comes out of 19th century Germany, right? There's a core message to the Torah, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. We could pick a whole bunch of ethical mitzvot, maybe a couple, only have one God, right? We have now one Ben Adam L'Makom, one of the ritual mitzvot, so to speak. And we can reduce Torah to its core principles. Right? Buber actually doesn't like that, and as he criticizes Reform, he'll say you can't reduce Torah to just a few mitzvot or a few core principles, because Torah is bigger than that, and our relationship with God is bigger than anything that can be reduced to a couple of sentences. And Buber is open to the possibility that Torah can be, speak to us in the here and now, even the parts of it that we're not maybe 100% sure that we know for certainty that they came from God. But when it comes to the mitzvot, when it comes to the commandments, Buber is much more reticent. He's much more unwilling just to assume that, well, maybe there's something still there, even though I'm not sure. With Torah, he's willing to say that. With the mitzvot, he has much more of a fundamental problem with them. And he goes on to say here in a letter to Franz Rosenzweig, this is in 1924, a few years after he writes this particular essay on freedom, he says, I do not believe, and this is about as clear as a formulation that you will get from Buber about revelation. He says, I do not believe that revelation is ever a formulation of law, right? Whatever happens in Revelation, whatever happened at Har Sinai, it wasn't that God gave a bunch of laws to people. It is only through man and his self-contradiction that revelation becomes legislation. So I want to just explain what Buber is saying here. For Buber, God never speaks. Didn't speak at Sinai, didn't speak to Abraham, right? God never speaks. That's not what revelation is. There's no content whatsoever to revelation. Human beings may encounter God, but God doesn't speak to human beings. And to the extent there are laws that emerge from revelation, they are human constructions and not divine, right? What we call mitzvot are brought into being, according to Buber, as a response to God. But they're always the construct, a human construct of a particular time and place. They might be true in that moment, right? They may be authentic and real as mitzvot, as laws in that moment, and especially for the person who experiences revelation, but those laws cannot be eternally true. In other words, just to give the practical example here, when Moses goes up on Har Sinai and he has this revelation with God and this encounter with God, the laws that Moshe comes down Har Sinai with are not God's, they're Moshe's own. And it doesn't mean that they aren't meaningful and powerful and important for the Jews of that time. Buber would say they are. I mean, they're, because Moshe was such a great prophet. That's what prophets do. They take revelation and they turn it into something meaningful for people. But the problem, Buber would point out, is those laws that Moshe developed from Revelation might have been necessary for the Jewish people, that generation of slaves who left Egypt, but that doesn't mean they are relevant to us as Jews thousands of years later, which for Buber, that means we shouldn't be bound by them. We shouldn't immediately assume we have to just, take all of this on. Now, you might say that even if the mitzvot were a specific historical response to an encounter with God at a particular moment and at a particular place, that still doesn't mean we should just dismiss them. Meaning, even if they were human constructs, for lack of a better expression, why does that mean we have to get rid of them? Like, maybe there's some good stuff in there. Maybe we should try to identify those mitzvot that appear relevant, like ethical ones, and see ourselves as obligated to them. And to a certain extent, that's what Reform did, early Reform, right? Either they reduced and said Judaism is only these principles, or they said, well, wait a second, we can find the mitzvot we really think came from God, the ones we like, the ones that work with us in 19th century Germany, and the rest of it must be, just human creations. However, Buber staunchly believes that the moment we submit to religious law as law, religious law that emerged from some point in the distant past, it's actually not only misguided, but spiritually dangerous. Buber really thinks you can't have religious law. It's going to be problematic, right? And here's how he goes on to explain it. He says, this is the fact of man. I cannot admit the law transformed by man into the realm of my will if I am to hold myself ready as well for the unmediated word of God directed to a specific hour of life, right? What Buber's saying here is that one who submits themselves to the law as law cannot be open to the unmediated word of God, right? The law actually closes you off from God, right? If you commit yourself to this law that emerged from the past, right, it actually prevents the possibility from revelation in the here and now. Now, one of the things I'll point out, and I'm not going to get into this a whole lot tonight, but I think it's just important to note that this kind of thinking is deeply Christian in a lot of ways, and is very, very much associated with Paul from the Pauline epistles, right? Emphasize again and again the problematic nature of the law. And the law blocks the Jews from God, and it blocks Jews from accessing the Spirit. And part of the gospel is that people, human beings, can now connect to God through Jesus, and they don't need law, because law is much more of a hindrance, an obstacle to God than a pathway to God. And you basically are seeing that here with with Buber. And again, once we get into modernity, right, where there's an emphasis on individual freedom, right, there's going to be a sense all around, wherever you are, whatever kind of thinker, Orthodox or not, that again, maybe submitting yourself to some sort of external religious law is not such a good thing. Right? Modernity is about a break from tradition and being able to start again free as human beings. It's about breaking the chains of religious mores and customs and laws that have bound us to a very specific way of being that we now recognize might be false or deeply problematic. But for Buber, just to summarize, if somebody wants to be open to revelation of experiencing God in the here and now, then submitting yourself to the law turns you away from the possibility of encountering God in that moment, right? You're so sort of focused and divided by these human created things that it cuts you off from God. And again, there are Hasidic ideas that do reflect this, right? We all kind of know. I'll give you one simple example. And this is, again, I said Buber has sort of a Christian dimension, but these ideas also emerge from the Jewish tradition. There's a famous story of the Baal Shem Tov, right? The founder of Hasidus. The Baal Shem Tov is traveling with some students, and they come across a synagogue in the midst of their travels, and they realize this would be a good time to stop and daven mincha, right? And they realize if they don't stop and daven mincha here, right, they're not going to have a chance to daven at a synagogue later in the day. So the Baal Shem Tov and his students go in the synagogue, and the Baal Shem Tov is about to daven, to start davening, and he just stops. And his students look at him, and they're perplexed. Well, Baal Shem Tov is known for his famous spiritual, intensely spiritual davening, right? Why is he stopping? Tefillah is so important to him. And he basically demands that he and the students leave, and they're going to go daven outside. And his students are just, again, perplexed. What is going on here? So they ask him, and he tells his students, he says, I wanted to daven in there, but I couldn't daven in there, in that Beit Knesset, in that synagogue. And the reason I couldn't daven in that synagogue is because it was so stuffed full of tefillot, of prayers said without kavanah, without spiritual intention, that I was being suffocated. So I had to go out of the synagogue to be able to pray properly. Now you can see in that little story some of the elements that Buber is talking about here, right? If you're so committed to the law that it cuts you off from the spiritual dimension, right? It actually is suffocating for authentic spirituality, right? And that's part of the message that the Baal Shem Tov was giving over. And again, Buber is famous also for his appropriation of Hasidic ideas and Hasidic stories. So again, Buber's concerned that law is spiritually problematic. There's something authentic to that even from within the Jewish tradition itself. And again, what Buber goes on to say, he says, if I have one principle of faith, it's that you can't submit to law, religious law, from external religious law, because that will ultimately be spiritually damaging to you. Now, as I mentioned, this is a fundamental principle for Buber, that one needs to be free to encounter God, to experience true spirituality. And he expands upon this in another letter where he points out that one doesn't need to necessarily get rid of all Jewish law. It's not like you just need to burn all the synagogues down. It's just that one has to approach it with the recognition that only the individual can decide whether a mitzvah speaks to them and whether it's relevant to their lives at that time. Meaning, the mitzvah may have good stuff in them, but you should never accept them as law. You have to kind of look at it and think about it and determine whether it works for you. And this is what Buber says about his own religious observance in his own life. He says, no, it is not clear to me. For as I've told you, since to me God is no lawgiver, rather only man is a receiver of law, I do not regard the law as universal, meaning he doesn't assume that the mitzvot of the Torah are binding today, that they continue to speak to all of us after thousands of years, but rather personal, right? I decide whether the law is something I'm going to take on, and if I do, it won't be as law. It'll be because it's something that I see as meaningful and spiritual and connecting. Namely, only what comes from it that I am forced to acknowledge as addressed to me. I got to feel like that mitzvah is talking to me if I'm going to do it. And again, it won't be as a mitzvah that it's commanding me. It's going to be because it speaks to me, that there's something in it that I hear God. He says, the example, the older I become and the more deeply I recognize the restlessness of my nature, the more does the day of rest mean to me. I mean, he's saying as I get older, I appreciate Shabbat more. And that means it becomes a bigger part of my life. But what he's implying is I would never take on Shabbat because it's a law, because it's something I'm commanded to do, because it's something that, to be a good Jew, you have to keep Shabbos. No. I, the individual, decide whether a mitzvah or religious practice is something that I'm going to take on. And it's going to be because it speaks to me, because I find it meaningful, because I connect to it, because I feel I have a deeper experience within it, right? Those are going to be the determining factors that are important. That a mitzvah is about meaning and relevance, and if it doesn't make sense in your life, don't do it. It's not going to be the rabbi or the community that tells you to do it. It's going to be the individual who's the final arbiter of what their religious practice should look like. And I should point out too here that Buber's understanding accords with very basic and, I would say, obvious liberal notions of modernity that we all buy in. None of us want to create a religious community, I don't think. None of us want to create a religious community where religious observance is being compelled, right? There's even a question in whether Jewish law even thinks religious observance should ever be compelled. The Jewish law in its own system tends to want to give people freedom and choice to do things rather than being forced to do it. But for our purposes, we know it. One of the tenets of liberalism, and I mean this not being on the left side of the political spectrum, just liberalism as the term for like liberal democracy. America, Israel are essentially liberal democracy. And what they are built on is this idea of the freedom of the individual, right? If you read the Constitution of the United States, right? What it emphasizes very strongly is the freedom of the individual, and it's the government's job to preserve the freedom of the individual. And what this reflects is some very, very important basic moral political ideas that people need to be free to choose for themselves the best path that is for them, right? Like this is like the fundamental tenet of liberal modernity democracy, right? People need to be free to choose for themselves. We don't force them to do things, especially not in religious areas, which becomes seen as a sort of private individual concern, right? We can't or shouldn't be imposing things on people from the outside. People should have as much freedom as possible to choose for themselves, unless, of course, right, the famous principle, unless, of course, right, you have too much freedom and your freedom is then impinging upon other people's freedom or hurting or injuring other people's freedom. But this idea that like people should be able to choose for themselves, it's something that we all kind of agree on. So when, on the one hand, I can look at Buber and say, what do you mean you get to pick and choose mitzvot, right? That's ridiculous. On the other hand, like that's the world we all live in today, right? That people do have the right and should have the right to choose what their lives are going to look like, and that individuals should be the final arbiter on most of the major choices that are going to determine what their life ultimately looks like. Now,
could I ask a question, Rabbi?
Please.
So I'm sort of stuck. So I can understand Rosenzweig. Rosenzweig says that revelation is critical. Revelation is critical. And as I understand it, he defines revelation as really achieving some kind of a personal connection of some kind, and that is affected through the Torah from God, from Sinai. And he says that can be renewed in the immediate. It can be renewed in the presence. And,
yes.
And through Torah, Rosenzweig asserts that you can renew revelation, and you can establish some kind of a personal relationship with God. And it's through the Torah, and I guess that means through the mitzvot. I understand that. But what I don't understand is what is Buber's concept of revelation, or does he not believe in revelation?
So that's no. You raise a very good question. So for Buber, revelation comes closest to his philosophical idea of the I-thou encounter. Yes. So again, part of the problem with Buber is that his terminology is very slippery. And he'll say revelation a lot, and he'll say certain things a lot, but you don't always know what he means. Part of this dialogue is Rosenzweig really trying to pin Buber down and say, well, what do you really mean? What do you really think? And we'll see a little bit more of it in a second. For Buber, revelation is about presence. It's about an experience of the unconditional, of the absolute, of like total meaning, total presence, total connection, right? These are the kinds of language that he uses to describe revelation. And again, there's something to it, right? We can have moments in which we feel we connect to something much, much bigger than ourselves that come with it a sense of meaning and purpose, right? Like this is where I'm supposed to be. This is what I'm supposed to do. This is what the moment requires, and it's bigger than me. Right, like that would be like a way to think about what Buber, how Buber understands revelation.
So is it reasonable then to say that from Buber's point of view, revelation is really a metaphysical, mystical occurrence, whereas Rosenzweig says, "Come on, it's real. It happened, and it's real, and here it is."
So I want to say yes, but it's complicated. Like there are elements of both of them that make them both mystical in certain ways and both not mystical exactly on this point. But I think the way you framed it is correct. I don't think it's wrong. But again, for Buber, life is about maintaining that. Well, so let me use the Hasidic example for a moment, right? To be a Hasid, right, as the Baal Shem Tov understands it, right, to a certain extent, and this comes out of Kabbalah in general, is to try to live your life with a sense of dveikut, right? A sense of union with God, right? A profound connection with God that you carry with you in all that you do. And that connection to God transforms the way you experience things in the here and now, right? Activities that could be prosaic and banal, when you are in the midst of dveikut, can suddenly be imbued with profound religious meaning, right? There's an example given about the the shoemaker and the way he ties binds the shoes together. But if it's done with dveikut, right, with this connection to God, even that act can be imbued with all this meaning. So for Buber, right, there's that is part, that's, you could say that like his idea of revelation is about this profound, intense, unmediated connection to God, but it doesn't come with like words and directions.
Yes, I understand that. But you see, where does this so-called connection to God come from?
Right. So Buber's very slippery about that.
And at least Rosenzweig makes it clear this is where it comes from.
Right. So Buber uses ideas like the spirit, Geist in German. Right, there's a romantic and Hegelian influence on Buber, but he is notorious for not wanting to really pin this stuff down. Okay. Right, so there's a way in which Buber could be read as like New Age spirituality, like the I don't know what the terms are for New Age spirituality these days, but like there's a power, there's a connection, there's something a force, right? Like there's a sense in which Buber's language is not dissimilar to that. And for someone like me who likes, real serious, rigorous, thinking, like that's part of the reason I find Buber frustrating, because it's not there. Let me continue, because I want to make sure we can keep going and we can get into Rosenzweig's understanding of revelation. The one other thing I'll just add here for Buber, he has an idea of mitzvah, but it's not mitzvah as commandment. Right, because it can't be commandment, because for him, revelation never directly leads to like a commandment that's from the outside directing me to do something. For him, the idea of mitzvah is more of an action, right? Like I was saying before, if I'm connected to God deeply, then whatever actions I do can be imbued with profound meaning and purpose. So if I'm connected, then it's those kinds of things that will enable mitzvot to take place, so to speak. And again, they're acts of freedom, right? Like I choose this, I experience this, I'm in this, I'm not being compelled to do so. And again, Buber says a line here that I could literally go to the book of Romans of Paul and show you a similar thing. He says sin means to live not in freedom. Right, that sin means being bound to the law, essentially. Right, he really is bothered by any notion that our autonomy, that our freedom would be constrained, because that gets in the way of what does it mean to have a connection with God. And there are Jewish sources that he draws on quite creatively to get at this. So it's not like this is all just being made out of thin air, but he constantly sidesteps this question of commandment. Now, for Rosenzweig is very clear. If there's anything to revelation, it's a sense of commandment. He says to Buber, I must once more come back to what you so dryly expressed. You place the dividing line between revelation and commandment. I do not understand that. Or else you have misunderstood me. By commandments, I mean something like Lech Lecha, meaning when God appears to Abraham, right? That appearance to Abraham, that initial appearance to Abraham in Perek Yud Bet of Bereshit, right? It's not just that God appeared to Abraham, right? Abraham's hearing of Lech Lecha was part of that revelation. You can't separate God's revelation from the command, right? They go together. Like there's just no separating them apart. No more for today, Rosenzweig says, for this has to be clear first, right? He's really trying to push Buber. What are you saying here, Buber? Now, again, part of it is, I think part of this misunderstanding is that Buber wants to totally reinterpret mitzvah as something I choose to do, right? But that's just not what a mitzvah is. Mitzvah is not, sometimes we say mitzvah means good deed, like you did something extra, that's good. But we know that mitzvah means commandment, right? So whatever mitzvah is going to be, you can't just reinterpret it as, that which I feel that I should do in the moment because it's relevant and it brings meaning and it's connection and it's something bigger than myself, right? That sounds true, and that may all apply to mitzvot, but mitzvot also is, has this dimension of commandments. Now, to play out Rosenzweig's understanding of revelation, we're going to turn briefly to the Star of Redemption. It's the very middle of the Star of Redemption. Rosenzweig actually calls it the heart of the Star of Redemption because it's the very middle chapter, and it's all about revelation. And it's not only all about revelation, it's specifically Rosenzweig's conception of revelation as love, revelation as the experience of love. Now, when we normally think about revelation, we probably do not normally think about love. And I'll just use, again, maybe the most famous example in the Torah, Har Sinai. Right? Har Sinai is the moment of revelation in the Torah. It's the theophany, as they say, when God makes God's self, known, unlike any other point before or after. And when you read the verses in Shemot about Har Sinai, you don't really get the experience of love, right? What you read and the experience that comes out of those verses, the experience of the Jewish people at Har Sinai, is one of terror. It's one of fear. It's one of being totally overwhelmed by God's presence, right? You're all probably familiar with the famous Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, right? What the Gemara says is that when the Jewish people experienced God's revelation at Har Sinai, it was as if God had picked up the mountain and held it over their heads and said, you either accept the Torah or you're going to be buried underneath the mountain, right? Which is the rabbi's way of saying that whatever happened at Har Sinai, it was all compulsion. It was all commandment. And we don't typically associate commandment with love. So where does Rosenzweig get this idea that love and commandment somehow go together? So what I will point out is that Chazal have an alternative understanding of Har Sinai as well, where it's not just about fear and terror and submission before this awesome power that we can't even begin to understand. The rabbis also conceive of Har Sinai as a moment of love, of profound love. And if God picked up the mountain and held it over the Jewish people's heads, there's at least one rabbinic interpretation that says God did that so that the mountain, Har Sinai, could serve as a chuppah for the marriage between God and the Jewish people, right? And there are many, many marriage metaphors that come out of the Har Sinai experience in the Midrashim. Again, you're probably familiar with on Shavuot, which we commemorate the revelation of Har Sinai, right? Sephardim, for example, have a custom of reading the ketubah that's been composed that's supposed to capture a relationship between God and the Jewish people. It's their own custom. It's composed, I think, in the medieval period or a little bit later. This idea of there's a ketubah between God and the Jewish people. And of course, if the Jewish people and God became married at Har Sinai, which is really just another a way of saying brit, of covenant, then what was the kedushin? What was it that betrothed God to the Jewish people? Well, at a chuppah, at a wedding, the chatan, the groom, gives the bride a ring. So at Har Sinai, God was the groom, and God gave the Jewish people the Torah as that act of betrothal. So there is this alternative view of Har Sinai that sees it as an experience of love, even as it is an experience of potentially fear and compulsion. So again, when you're aware of all this, you could start saying, well, wait a second, like, was Har Sinai this schizophrenic experience? Was it like this split personality? What the heck was going on here? Can receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai, can revelation really be a moment of both fear and love at the same time? So the short answer to this for Rosenzweig is yes, because love is a strange and very powerful thing. In the last 2 centuries, Western culture has developed a very specific notion of romantic love, right? That love is free, love is chosen, and love cannot be commanded. Remember I said before how Buber said you can never submit to law, that it defeats the whole purpose? Well, that's kind of the way most of us think about love. Most of us do not think love can be compelled, right? Most of us would say that an arranged marriage is going to have a very hard time leading to love. We think love is something you kind of have to experience and choose for yourself. Nobody can force it on you. But in truth, the reality is more complicated. This Western romantic notion of love, free love, right? Romantic love, right? Like you choose and you find the right person, and it's the right match, and everything's amazing, right? Like that's not necessarily the way love really works. The reality is more complicated. Love is free, all right? But love also binds. It always binds us to the other. We lose ourselves within it, but love also makes demands upon us and requires loyalty. When we enter into an exclusive love relationship, we are acknowledging that we have new responsibilities and obligations that did not exist before. Forget even marriage. If you come to the realization that you love somebody, that imposes responsibilities on you because you cannot treat your beloved just like they're another person walking down the street. They mean too much to you. If they want something, they need something, you feel you got to be there for them. You care about them. You're worried about them, right? Love imposes all of these responsibilities and obligations on us. And that's the reason, as you may be aware, that the bride or groom may get cold feet before their wedding. Because no matter how much they love each other, or they think they love each other, especially in that Western romantic sense, they know that by committing to marriage, a covenantal relationship, which is what love always really creates, they're entering into a new reality with both radical possibilities, but also profound burdens. Love always imposes responsibilities upon us. And I'll just read here. We don't have time to do all of this, but we'll just do a little bit of it. Rosenzweig says, love is as strong as death, which for Rosenzweig means when you have to confront death, if you have to confront the possibility of your own death, it just overwhelms you, right? Like it seizes you. It's like, oh my God, I've never experienced anything like this before. It terrifies you. But love is equally as strong as death in the way that it grasps the totality of our being. Against whom is it that death shows its strength? Against the one whom it seizes. And love, certainly it seizes both the lover as well as the beloved, right? To experience the love of another person, it just makes a claim on your whole being. And you feel it in ways that you can't even quite put into words. As it says here in the translation, you're seized by it, right? It grasps all of you, right? And you just can't shake it. Now, for Rosenzweig, the experience of love always comes with that sense of commandment, because when you love somebody, or when you feel somebody's love for you, right, you feel bound to them in ways that are often difficult to put into to words. As I said, you can't command somebody to fall in love, but the experience of another person's love on you, it changes you. It grips you and it penetrates to the very depths of your being. And as I said, you can't help but be transformed by it. To be loved by another person is a form of command, a demand, again, for everything from us. And this is the reason why receiving the Torah at Har Sinai was so challenging for the Jewish people. Even if it was a moment of love, it could still be kind of terrifying and overwhelming, because experiencing God's all-encompassing love was beautiful and uplifting and full of meaning, but as I said, also terrifying and overwhelming because of the obligations and the responsibilities that love always places on us. And the same holds true for the love that we experience in every deep relationship of our lives. With the experience of love, when you fall in love, when you feel the love of the other, when you return it, and when you fall in love, right, we always experience a sense of command, of being bound to them. And the commandment here that Rosenzweig says is behind revelation, he says it's v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, right? It's always the sense that you should love the other, right? Like you experience their love and you experience as a command to return that love. I'll just read a little bit of this. Rosenzweig, if v'ahavta, sorry, not v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, v'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, that you should love the Lord your God. That's what revelation is, right? Revelation is us experiencing God's love, and us feeling the command, the compulsion, the obligation, being bound to God and feeling like we need to return that love. And of course, Rosenzweig addresses here the very fact that how can we be commanded to love God, right? Love's an emotion. You can't command an emotion. And he comes up with maybe the most brilliant answer you will ever find for this. He says can love be commanded? Isn't love destiny and being deeply touched? And if it is free, isn't it a free offering, right? Like love is, again, supposed to be free. You're supposed to feel it. You're supposed to choose it. How can love be commanded by somebody else? And now it's being commanded, right? That's what happens in Revelation. God's commanding our love. Surely love cannot be commanded. No third party can command it or obtain it by force. No third party can do this, but the one can. God can. The commandments of love can only come from the mouth of the lover. Only the one who loves, but he can say and does say, love me. From his mouth, the commandments of love is not a strange commandment. It is nothing other than the voice of love itself. When you experience the love of your beloved, of the person who loves you, you experience that as a command that says, love me, please, love me. I love you, love me, love me. The love of the lover has no other word to express itself than as commandment. That's what love is. To experience the love of a person, of another person, is to experience them saying love me to you, right? And that's pure commandment, and it binds you to them. And again, if you've been married, if you've been in a relationship for a long time, you know this, right? Like, you're bound to your spouse whether you like it or not, and you feel that sense of responsibility and obligation and compulsion to them, right? They can't even put it into words. You can't even put it into words, but you feel it, right? They just look at you and you feel it, like it's like as if they're saying, love me. And again, if you struggle with having to say felt it that way with your spouse, what Rosenzweig is describing here also applies to our children, very, very much so. When our children are born into this world, they cry. That's what a baby does when they're born. And that cry, an infant's cry, is a cry of love me. And when you're a father or a mother and you're in that maternity room and you hear that your child cry for the first time, you hear that cry of love me, because that's what the baby's cry is. You feel it as a compulsion to love them, and you do, right? Children, it's so funny because it almost comes in that very moment, right? Like, but your children force you to love them, right? And that's what revelation is, to feel that sense of being bound, that sense of compulsion. And again, we don't typically conceive of love that way, but that's why love makes covenants, makes brit, right? Because it just binds us to the other in ways that we can never fully put into words. Now, the only other thing I'll mention before we move on and look to wrap up is that Rosenzweig, like Buber, is aware of the possibility that the laws in the Torah per se are sort of like, I don't know how to say this. There's revelation, there's God's commandment, but it doesn't mean that commandment is felt in all the laws of the Torah at all times. And remember, Rosenzweig did not grow up from. He has no proofs or no absolute confidence that every letter of the Torah was given to the Jewish people at God, right? How could he? There's simply no proof for that, right? So he can't immediately assume such a thing is true, right? If he could, right, he would be Orthodox and he would just keep all the mitzvot, right? He also is not so sure that God is a lawgiver, so to speak, right? Because the commandments of love isn't something that really is so much put into words. It compels me. I'm obligated. I feel that being bound to God and the compulsion that comes along with it. But the laws, right? Laws are always about the past or about the future. For Rosenzweig, love is about the pure present, right? So law is something that maybe emerges out of love, but it is not necessarily the direct manifestation of love itself. Right? I'll give you an example, like in marriage. Right, couples come up with all sorts of rules about how they're going to organize their life. Right, you're going to do the dishes on Monday mornings, and I'm going to do the laundry, and you're going to take care of this kid, and I'm going to make sure to do that kid. And we come up with all these sort of arrangements that reflect the way in which we feel bound to each other. But those arrangements themselves aren't like some essential manifestation of the specifics of our love. Right, they're sort of like an outward expression of it, but as we know, rules and those kinds of arrangements can change over time. Right? Over the course of a marriage, some of those things will kind of move in different directions, right? Because no relationship is ever permanently static, right? It can't be written in stone and say, okay, this is what it's going to be for eternity, right? So for Rosenzweig, he's aware that certainly laws change, Torah's laws change, right, over time through the tradition, right? But nevertheless, right, law represents the possibility of connecting back to mitzvah. And this is maybe the most important idea for Rosenzweig. There's no other way to get to God other than through the Torah and through law. Rosenzweig is very, very clear about that to a large extent, at least for Jews. Whereas Buber thinks law is the impediment to getting to God, for Rosenzweig, law is maybe the only way we can get back to God. And he is open to the possibility that law can always become mitzvah. Law can always become that moment of love where we just feel compelled and drawn inextricably to God and whatever God is asking of us in that moment, even if we're not 100% sure about what it is. But when we experience that moment of mitzvah, that moment of revelation, that moment of compulsion, that moment of obligation that we simply cannot deny, right? That's the moment where God becomes real for us. That's what revelation is. And for Rosenzweig, that is the idea of today, of Hayom, right? Throughout the Torah, and especially for the rabbis, there's an assumption that everything goes back to Har Sinai. Everything goes back to that revelatory moment. And that revelatory moment can be experienced not just thousands of years ago, but Hayom, right? We say in the paragraphs of the Shema, it specifically says, you need to keep the mitzvot that I command you today. And the rabbis say there that the today, when those mitzvot are commanded, are again, not thousands of years ago, but today in the here and now. And for Rosenzweig, that potential is always there within law to experience it and in that particular fashion. So I want to just do one more letter here before we wrap up from Rosenzweig to Buber, because he does clarify, I think, a lot of these points in a very clear fashion. He says here, the question concerning the law, as well as the one concerning God himself, should not be treated in the third person. Meaning, we can't treat questions about law and did it come from Har Sinai and did it come from God, or even God's existence. We can't treat these as like facts to be debated. I too do not know whether the law is God's law. Right? I don't know which of the mitzvot, if all the mitzvot came from God, he might say. And again, I know that is radical, and we'll develop that in further sessions. But I'll just point out the obvious, right? Much of Jewish life is not d'oraisa. It's not, from the Torah. It's from the rabbis. And again, that doesn't mean that it cannot be, as holy as anything else. Right? So the question of whether something comes directly from God or not is not always as significant a question as we might think in Judaism. But again, we'll unpack that in some of the future sessions. But he says, I don't know whether the law is God's law. I know that as little and even less than I know that God is, right? He says, I know God is, but I don't know if the law is all God's law. Knowledge or ignorance is not valid when an experience has been made. And this is maybe one of the most important aspects of Rosenzweig's thought. Right? Religious life is not based on proofs. It's not based on facts that we can somehow prove to be true from the tradition or from philosophy or anything like that. At the end of the day, we know something is true because we've experienced it in our flesh and blood, right? Because we just know it's true, because it's made its way into our life as a fact that we can't deny. Maybe we can't explain it, but we know we can't deny it. And for Rosenzweig, God is a fact he can't deny. Whether the law came from God, that he doesn't quite know. As far as you have made the experience that the law is not God's law, and it is this experience on which your sentence is based, that is a valid one. He says to Buber, you know what? If you don't think the law is from God, that's your right. Because at the end of the day, we can only know things based on, like I said, like whether their truth for us in our life is something we simply can't deny. If you haven't experienced it that way, what can I say? Right? It's still, your approach is valid. He says, as valid as an atheism based on an experience that God does not exist. Or if someone doesn't believe in God, somebody's never experienced God in their life, are you going to just like turn around and tell them they're liars? They don't know what they're talking about? I know the truth. I know God, and you're a deceiver that you don't know this. Right? No, there's a truth to atheism. To live as a person in the modern world is to see the possibility of God's non-existence as possible, right? And who are we to turn around and start condemning people who don't believe in God? After the Holocaust, we're going to condemn people for not believing in God. After the tens of millions dead in the 20th century, we're going to condemn people for not believing in God. Right? There's a certain truth is if people don't believe in God from their own experience, right? Who are we to say that they are, completely wrong? Whereas he who does not know that God exists, or whether God exists, must not frighten us. The atheist doesn't frighten us, though, just because they don't believe in God. Because at the end of the day, as I said, truth is something that emerges from our own lives and our own experiences. Thus, revelation is certainly not law-giving. It is only this revelation. So he kind of agrees with Buber that, again, it's not that revelation comes with all this specific detail and content, it comes as a truth that makes its presence known in our life. But as I said, it's the truth of revelation is commandment. It's the commandment to love. It's to experience God's love and the commandment to love God. The primary content of revelation is revelation itself. He came down on Sinai. He's now looking at the verses in Perek Yud Tet of Shemot, right? That the Shekhinah, God, came down to Sinai. This already concludes the revelation. He spoke is the beginning of interpretation, and certainly I am, right? When it says God speaks, and then it says Anochi Hashem Elokecha, right? The first of the Aseret Dibro, that's already in sort of the level of human interpretation, right? That the revelation is God's appearance is the divine part. Everything else is sort of up in the air. But where does this interpretation stop being legitimate? I would never dare to state this in a general sentence. Here commences the right of experience to give testimony, positive or negative. But he says, you know what? Who am I to say where God is or isn't in the Torah, right? If there's one great sin for Jews in modernity, it's that there are Jews who think they can tell you where God is or isn't in the Torah. Like, we don't get to do that. That's probably one of Rosenzweig's most fundamental points, because anything can be revelatory and divine in the Torah. Or could it be that revelation must never become legislation? Because then the original self-interpretation of the revelation would have to give way to human interpretation. This I would admit, just as I'm convinced that revelation cannot be identified with a human person. He says Rosenzweig's still skeptical that revelation could lead to specific content-filled commandments. You got to do this, and you got to not eat that animal, but you can't eat this, and you can't do this on Shabbat, but you can do that. He's skeptical that revelation has those kinds of manifestations, but he still says, you know what? Who am I to say that such a thing is not possible? He says, just as he doesn't think philosophically that revelation can be identified with a human person, like he doesn't believe that God could become a human being, right? But in spite of my conviction, as I concede to a Christian historic and personal right to prove an exception. Just because I don't believe something is possible doesn't mean I deny the possibility that it might be true for somebody. So I believe in the right of the law to prove its character as an exception against all other types of law. Even if I'm not sure that revelation is commandment, I'm not sure whether it can lead to law, but who am I to question at least the possibility of it? This is the point where the question put forward in The Builders, which is an essay he wrote in response to Buber, to be an answer to your question. A question this becomes an answer to a question. This may not satisfy the first inquirer, but it makes it difficult for him to give an answer based on his life today, because it opens up for him a view of tomorrow. This must be your position as regards The Builders. So don't worry about the last part there, but for our purposes, to summarize, we have to be open to the possibility that law can become mitzvah, right? Even if we're not 100% sure that every law that we experience, whether it's written in the written Torah or from the rabbis, even if we're not sure that it is divine or truly holy, it has the possibility of being something through which we can experience God's love and God's and commandments. And if you reject law, or you view law as something that you can only take on because it's meaningful, because it connects to it, because it fits in your life, that means you're basically closing yourself off to God entirely. There's a fascinating machloket here, right? For Buber, unless you reject law as something being compelled upon you, you can't connect to God, right? Law is the impediment to God. Rosenzweig is the exact opposite. Law is the only way in which we can truly experience God's revelatory love and the commandment that goes with that. And I'll conclude just by saying that again, for Rosenzweig, he identifies correctly, in my opinion, that at the heart of Judaism is this sense of being bound to God and the obligations and the responsibilities and the compulsions that come out of that, right? And again, using the love metaphor here, if there's anything that defines me being married to my wife, it's the way I feel bound to her, right? That no matter wherever I am, like I feel like I'm like there's like a connection between us. That I always kind of know where I am in relationship to her, and I always feel like I have certain responsibilities and obligations to her. Like that, she's like just almost like she's saying, "Love me," and wherever I am, I hear that and I feel bound and connected to that, and I can't escape it. And that's what it means to be a Jew, to feel bound and connected to God in such a similar fashion. We don't always feel that way, But halacha, law, is like the chain that connects us and ultimately, binds us to God, so that we have those potential moments where we just turn around and just realize that we hear God's call, we experience God's love, and we can't escape it. And again, God's love here is not like the sort of Christian love of like, God's love makes me feel whole, or God's love means forgiveness, or God's love means that like all my sins are washed away. That's not the way Rosenzweig understands divine love. Divine love is that sense of being bound and connected. And I can't escape, I can't escape you. Like I'm bound to you. You love me, and I love you. And that's just the way it's going to be. So next time we'll dig again a bit deeper into Rosenzweig's understanding of halacha, and how halacha can connect us back to mitzvah, to revelation, and how the Baal Tshuva engages halacha, right? For Rosenzweig, what's very significant is that the Baal Tshuva just can't take on all the mitzvah all at once, that there's something very problematic about that. And we kind of already saw this here a bit, right? Rosenzweig himself said, right, something is only true when you experience it in your life as a fundamental truth. And you can't just take on all the 613 mitzvot and just say they're all completely true and they're divinely commanding me in the here and now. No Baal Tshuva can firmly say that. And I'll even go so far to say no convert can firmly say that, even though a convert is supposed to accept upon themselves all the mitzvot, and in principle they certainly do, right? No convert can enter into Judaism being fully ready to do all of the mitzvot, right? And just know them all and just do them perfectly, right? To be bound to God means that there has to be halacha, there has to be, mitzvot that are potentially binding us, but how we navigate them and how they play out in our lives is going to be a very big question.